The impact of climate change on residential property is almost part of the daily news cycle now, and if the recent federal election is anything to go by, more Australians appear to be taking climate change seriously. Individually, our increasing energy bills are encouraging more of us to consider sustainability features in our homes, and on a more drastic scale, climate change has caused a displacement of hundreds of people, potentially thousands, and the possibility of them finding alternative accommodation in regions where a rental crisis was looming even before the flood or fire that rendered their home uninhabitable. The eye-watering repair bills from natural disasters are encouraging wider discussions about how long can we continue to live on floodplains and on the ocean's edge, especially given the rising number of buildings that are uninsurable or simply too expensive to insure. I don't know about you, but I feel we're on a cusp of some pretty dramatic, necessary change in the way we approach housing in this country. Are our policy makers able to keep up?
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia and author of Auction Ready.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say on here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of a professional.
Don't forget that you can access the transcript for this episode on the website, as well as download our free full or forecaster report, Which Experts Can You Trust to Get It Right? theelephantintheroom.com.au.
Today we're talking about the impact climate change is or should be having on housing policy, and I'm joined by Nicki Hutley, a highly experienced economist and councillor on the Climate Council. After many years in the corporate world, most recently as a partner with Deloitte Access Economics, Nicki has now branched out on her own, specialising in the area of climate change and advising governments, business and not-for-profits. It's been 3 years since we last had you on the podcast, Nicki, and a lot has changed since then. Thank you so much for coming back on today. It is very nice to see you again.
Thanks, Veronica. It's lovely to be here and be back with you.
Now, before we get into this juicy topic, I'm intrigued actually, because on a personal level, you got out of the corporate world and you really have focused on this aspect of economics, I guess, and I guess it's even beyond economics, really, isn't it? What led you to focus on this, or focus your work on this area?
So I've actually worked in climate economics for close to 15 years. In fact, it was one of the first areas that I sort of took up when I was moved into consulting from financial markets. But of course, back in the day when the Garneau paper was out and we had the Rudd government, and there was a very different attitude towards climate. And in fact, of course, we then had an emissions trading scheme. We introduced the renewable energy targets. We had feed-in tariffs. There was a lot of economics work. And then, of course, that all changed with the election of Tony Abbott, and, climate was basically a four-letter word. And from a policy perspective, there was not a lot that we could do. But the urgency of the task, watching, report after report, especially from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the urgency of the task has led more people to be interested in the topic. And I found myself falling back into that space because it was something that I've always been really interested in, social and environmental impacts when it comes to economics. And so it was just, for me, the time was right to get back into that space rather than perhaps discovering it for the first time.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting stuff. And it does certainly, it's almost like you can't ignore it anymore, isn't it? I mean, that appears to be that even the deniers are starting to, maybe acknowledge that, maybe we've got a bit of a problem. But the interesting, I looked at a report that the Climate Council recently released, which was reporting on the increasing number of uninsurable homes. Look, this was quite alarming. I looking at some of those numbers in there is absolutely alarming. And it seems to me that this issue has been hiding in plain sight for some time. I mean, how would you describe the extent of this problem?
Look, this has been going on for a long time. I mean, I did some work with Suncorp probably 6 or 7 years ago now when they were looking at the Northern Australia. We did a piece of work called Protecting the North, which was around cyclone-related home insurance premium. And, of course, the government at the time put into place an inquiry into that because the insurance companies were being accused of, jacking up their premiums. And, this was seen as, they're just taking profits. But in actual case, it wasn't, because we had cyclone after cyclone. And, of course, Yazzie then came in and did so much damage right on the back of, and I've now forgotten the name of the previous one, but, we had all of these damages. And so we were looking then at saying, well, what are the things that you can do to make a house more cyclone proof that might reduce the cost of the insurance premiums? And not long before that, we'd also looked at what were the cost benefits of putting in levies in flood-prone areas for exactly the same reason, the potential not just homes but businesses, of course, as well, that go under. So it's not new by any stretch of the imagination, but I think, there are people that will tell you that they weren't able to get in home insurance after the floods in 2011 either, or at least not get it at any affordable level. People saying quotes of $30,000 or $40,000 for premiums. So it's not entirely new, but I think the difference now is that we have just had 3 years back to back, the most catastrophic fires that we have ever seen and the most catastrophic floods that we have ever seen, and back-to-back floods as well, people, who barely getting over the last lot and faced again. And I think this has been the tipping point for Australians, is actually seeing climate change as something that is now, not something in the future.
Which is a shame, isn't it? Because really it takes a long can we even turn it around, let alone slow it down? And, so much change needed to happen so long ago. But now we're here. One of the things in the report, which really, I guess is a great interactive map in there. We'll put the link in the show notes as well, so you can play around with that, listeners. But there's some areas where really it's forecast that potentially 9 out of 10 houses could become uninsurable. And there's a difference between uninsurable, or I guess what is the definition of uninsurable? It doesn't mean that literally premiums are just ridiculously expensive and nobody in their right mind would pay them. It doesn't make sense to pay them. Or is it that literally the insurance companies will not insure certain buildings?
Well, I guess we've probably got a little bit of a disagreement with the insurance industry over that, because they will are adamant that everything is insurable at a price. But we've heard only recently, that people, businesses in the ski fields have been unable to get insurance off the back of the Black Summer fires, and they have actually been refused insurance. The majority of insurance companies pulled out of far north Queensland after post-Yazzie because they just couldn't offer it, although there are some that were there. But look, even if you can find an insurer, it's a question about what is reasonable for you to afford. So if someone says you can insure your home for $30,000 a year, well, that may as well not exist. So I think when we say it's uninsurable at an affordable rate for the average household. So, I think that's technically someone might offer you a product, but it's not something that anybody in their right mind is going to want or be able to afford.
Yeah. And I think potentially that sort of leads into an area of disadvantage as well, because these areas that are becoming uninsurable, I would imagine have you done any modelling in terms of what's that going to do to values of property in those areas?
We haven't yet got around to the values, but, anecdotally, again, what we're hearing is, people who might have been wanting to sell their place just before this latest batch of floods that we've had are now finding that they actually can't, that they just can't sell. So it's not even just that there's a drop in price, but you would expect that the fall in price is going to be equivalent to reflect that much increased premium that you're going to have to pay. So you're going to find places where it's just you can't sell it because nobody wants to take that level of risk. Or if they're prepared to take the risk because they think they can do things to mitigate. So, what's the cost of putting your house up on stilts, for example? So if you estimate that to be, 40, 50,000, conservatively, I imagine, depending on the house, then that's what's going to come off the price. Much the same way as if you find, you want to buy a house, you make an offer, you find out with a pest inspection there's $10,000 worth of damage that needs to be repaired, you're going to ask for that off the price. And I think that's the same thing, although obviously with insurance it's not just a one-off, it's a premium every year. So that's going to have a massive impact potentially on some houses if there is no community mitigation like a levy or raising a dam or other things that you can do at the household level.
The problem with that, and We interviewed historian and academic Margaret Cook about her book, Brisbane, A River with a City Problem. Have you ever read that book?
I haven't actually. Now I'm going to have to go out and grab it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And she really goes back to, pre-development of Brisbane and looks really quite forensically at, I guess, all the different political and commercial powers at play and why effectively Brisbane was built on a floodplain and why it continued to be developed even though there was some significant flooding, and why they've pinned hopes on dams, foolishly as it turns out, because dams can't do the entire job, and on and on and on. And so it's a fascinating book. That's episode 228 if anybody wants to go back and listen to that one. It's pretty clear, though, a lot of development just should never have happened. And then it's like sunk cost. You've gone so far and then you just got to keep digging yourself out of it over and over again. So I'm sort of curious to know, at what point does it become economically unviable to keep putting money into fixing and repairs and try to remediate problems, maybe with some mitigation, versus the actual, at what point do you say, well, enough's enough, we really need to relocate? I'm not necessarily saying we should relocate Brisbane, by the way, but, like Rockley, there's certain suburbs that are going to continue and always flood. At what point is that decision, or should that decision be made to say enough's enough, we need to actually move people?
Look, I think this is one of the big failures at the moment, is that we haven't got the modelling that says, relocating this particular suburb or group of houses within a suburb, relocating entire suburbs with, tens of thousands of houses is just logistically a nightmare. So I think it's going to be better to try and find other ways of mitigating. But if you're talking about smaller areas, and of course we have the Lockyer Valley as an example of where you had the government buybacks. But of course, this is disrupting people from their communities. So there's immense social costs, putting kids in new schools. Which schools are they going to go to? What are you going to have to spend on the new infrastructure as you relocate those? Nobody has yet done that economic analysis. Hopefully sooner or later one of the governments will come up and say, we want this sort of work. It is something I am thinking about, though, at the moment, is exactly that is when is it worth moving? I mean, you're right. You cannot possibly relocate the entirety of Brisbane. I mean, there's just too much infrastructure, too much business that goes on. So what are the things that you can do to mitigate, at least to some extent, even having a better emergency response, a quicker emergency response, is part of that equation, as well as adapting our systems. Because however quickly we act on climate change now, we've already gone in Australia, it's 1.4 degree warming. The global average is 1.1. These worst fires, these worst floods, worse, more intense cyclones, perhaps fewer but more intense. These are fixed into our future. And just the degree of how bad they are depends on how much action we take in the next 10 years. But you're not going to stop it or eradicate it. As many people point out, we've always had natural disasters, but these are unnatural disasters that climate change is magnifying, the impact. So there are some deep, difficult questions that have to be asked. And there are certainly some parts of our cities where we have built where we are going to have to face the decisions that people can't live there, or if they choose to stay, they're literally taking their lives into their own hands. But it's the cost of cleaning up this bad planning decision or decisions is immense. Absolutely
There's
immense.
two things that come to the fore of my mind when you're talking there. One is that deep decision making. That's our pollies have not been particularly good at that for the last few decades. And so at what point will they actually put aside the politics and actually start making some good decisions? And then the other thing about that really came to the front of my mind there was around the compounded disadvantage of low-income earners, who effectively often find themselves either, if they can buying in these more risky areas, or renting also, because the rents are cheaper generally in areas that are more prone to this sort of damage, particularly with flood. Bushfire maybe has got some other considerations. And then we've got this massive rental crisis, of which the climate's only one of the players in that. There's been other forces at play which have really set us up to have a rental crisis at the moment. I think that, as I said, in the federal election, I think, as a nation, we're starting to call our politicians to account to say, actually, we realise now things need to change. What do you think, other than politics, what is going to bring things to a head where our politicians will make these tough calls, will actually invest in the modelling, as you're talking about, and the proper research to make better decisions? And can they do that in an election cycle, within an election cycle?
Look, I think they absolutely can do. I think, as you say, I think, we've got a clear message from this last election that people, the majority of Australians now want, are standing firmly behind greater action. They understand that it will come at a cost, and they want to be supported, quite rightly, as we go through that transition. The thing that disappoints me, and you see it in climate change and you see it in planning, is that vested interests keep pushing their own agenda rather than what is in the interests of the greater public. And unfortunately, politicians, because of donations or the way the system works, who's in theoretical bed with whom, we get these poor decisions. I would just cast my mind back to the COVID recovery spending. How much was spent on the housing construction and renovations, when we know that was not necessary as it turned out. And it is of the single biggest things domestically that have affected inflation in the March quarter. You had what was going on in Ukraine, you had global supply chain issues, COVID, nothing that the government could have done anything about, or the Reserve Bank, but the construction prices, housing price costs of the building were the biggest single driver. And, this was just not responsible policy, but there were vested interests that pushed the high-vis recovery, unfortunately, rather than thinking this through a lot more sensibly. And until we get that, it's a very long-winded way of saying that there are too many vested interests, and it takes a lot of, politicians really have to be convinced that they're not going to be turfed out by going too far on these fronts. It is interesting to see the New South Wales government, is forging ahead with all sorts of things, though, and I think they've been incredibly brave on a lot of these fronts, not just on the climate action, which they've thought through incredibly well, but now thinking about, stamp duty reform. It's great to see a government that is prepared to lead, but it's been a really long time since we've seen that, and a lot of them are really scared.
It has been a long time. In terms of government policy, because housing... and it is complicated, let's face it, in this country, because we're so dominated by A, real estate or property, and B, lending for property, and C, building property. And you know what I mean? Our whole economy is so intrinsically tied up with this. And so it is quite hard to unravel it all. But I mean, I understand that there is a proposal to upgrade the National Building Code to 7 stars, for instance. But even when you look at BASICS, which is the building code, it could go further. They could all go further.
They could all go so much further. And I mean, this is the recent sort of number crunching that we did. There's, again, some in the sector, and this is not everybody. The Property Council supports the move, quite a few in the industry too, but there are a few intransigent voices that are saying, it'll be too expensive. If you are, and we found the builders that we spoke to who were doing this already, who were looking at, said within a couple of years, they'd already cut the cost from 14,000 down to 6,000 on average to get this, that the payback for homeowners was, sort of maximum 10 years, but an average of 5 years because of the energy savings that they got. And of course, that will be
shrinking.
Given energy costs at the moment, that will be rapidly diminishing. You'll get the payback much more quickly. And then some say, what about low income households that can't afford 6,000? It's like, well, if you can afford $350,000 to build a new home, and that's a very conservative estimate, but that is the sort of national average at this stage.
Has it got up to 400 recently?
Well, it probably has. The most figures I was looking at the other day might not have been updated yet, but say 6,000 on 350 or 400 is relatively small, particularly when you're funding that through a mortgage over 30 years. and you're paying it back within 5 years. It's, in fact, the regulation impact statement, which did some economic modelling around this, and it had a lot of problems with it, but even it said this makes really no difference to the average mortgage holder. It's going to be, just incidental costs. So I think, plus you save money, plus you save the environment. I mean, it's crazy not to do it.
It is. And I think there have been some initiatives. I know the New South Wales government had an initiative to try to get the landlords of lower socioeconomic accommodation, so in the cheaper rent areas, shall we say, an initiative to actually get those landlords to put in place some of these sustainability features in the houses. It could be insulation, it could be solar panels, it could be changing the way hot water is created, more efficient ways, more efficient appliances. But the problem is, and I always thought that was a little naive, it's like you're targeting people, you're going in an uphill battle. You're almost better off to go for those that are already aware and already prepared to invest in their properties rather than those that not necessarily investing in their properties. But once again, though, it feeds back into that disadvantage, doesn't it? Because then you've got tenants that can't necessarily afford to move, can't necessarily afford a better place to live, and then are stuck with higher energy bills as a consequence of living in properties that really are not very efficient.
If you like what you're hearing here, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars, please. Every review helps make it easier for other people to find us and hear what our amazing guests have to say. We love hearing your questions and we're planning more listener Q&A episodes. Please send your questions in. You can send them via the website, which is theelephantintheroom.com.au, or directly via email to questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au.
No, it's a really perverse incentive. But we found some work I did a while back, looked at commercial buildings, and, 6-star buildings get higher rates of rent than 3-star or 1-star. So if you pay a slightly higher rate of rent, but you're actually saving on your energy bills over time, again, the payback is relatively short periods of time. And the same is true for housing. You'll get... But I guess the market is such that vacancy rates are so low that, landlords don't really care a lot of the time. But this is why the New South Wales government's latest proposal, and look, it's, I think it's sort of 60,000 people it's targeted who are eligible for the energy rebate, giving them the opportunity that they will install solar for you. You give up the rebate and you get the solar in, so you pay back pretty quickly because you're not getting the rebate, but obviously you're not paying as much on your bill. So they're targeting all those low-income households, potentially a lot of renters who wouldn't necessarily, their landlords might not do it, but they've got the opportunity, and in social housing to put it in there, big program around installing more energy. And for those where solar might not be possible, an energy efficiency audit, and then help to, again, which makes so much more sense, handing out voucher after voucher to help people is just like, you're banging your head on the brick wall. You're not changing anything. Whereas if you invest that money up front and then you save the emissions and you're saving the households in perpetuity. I mean, again, it's just logical, but it's very hard sometimes to, take away those rebates. People go, I'm not getting something. But when you explain to householders and say, we're taking this thing away, but what we're giving you is actually going to save you a lot more money, and it will save it to you forever, and you don't ever have to come and apply to things. You don't keep having to fill out forms. You just will save all on your own. It's like, okay, this has got to be a good idea. So I'm really pleased to see that state governments are doing more of that. The ACT government's got a program where you can borrow interest-free up to around, I think it's $20,000, and you can put it towards a package of things. So it could be a solar and a solar battery, or appliances, or, whatever you want. You just go and do a very brief training program to say these are all the sorts of things you can do and why and how. And then off you go, put in your application, which, again, fantastic. So for households that can't necessarily get hold of the cash or borrow the money up front, really good way to get changes happening.
So in a way, there's sort of no excuse, is there?
There's absolutely no excuse whatsoever. And this is where I I get a bit frustrated. I mean, New South Wales government, as much as I think they do a lot of great things on climate, the backflip around planning on banning dark roofs. I mean, no logical reason for that. We absolutely have to do everything we can. The urgency of the task of getting to net zero cannot be overstated. It is just, we are way, way behind.
It is.
And we can get there, but boy, we need to do everything we can as quickly as we can. So let's take the low-hanging fruit. I mean, that's an easy win.
I know.
There are things that are a lot harder. So save your energy for those.
It is ridiculous, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like wearing masks on public transport. It's like, what imposition is it? What imposition is it to say to somebody, I'm sorry, you can't have a dark roof? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I find, obviously when you're watching the news and there's always those aerial shots and they've got stories about the housing market, there's always these aerial shots of new housing subdivisions. And I'm still amazed at how many of them don't have a solar panel in sight. And that is another example, I guess, what you're talking about earlier, the powers that, or the interest groups, shall we say, that are lobbying against quite simple measures that at the end of the day really pay back over a very short period of time. What other sort of policy areas? I mean, we've sort of strayed away from the insurance thing, but it's all things that need. I mean, the insurance thing almost is like the catastrophic end or the catastrophic result of climate change. And what we're talking here are quite simple things that all of us can do in reality, and the governments obviously can support. But in between, I guess, what are some of the issues that the Climate Council is really wanting to raise awareness of? What else is low-hanging fruit, I guess, is my question there.
Yeah, so I think if you think of this as a journey, is the first thing is how do we help lower emissions as quickly as possible? So, having our building codes, even if you've got an existing home now, that if your house, like I live in a house that's like 100 years old and, it's great in the summer, but in the winter it is freezing. And so even something as simple as draft extruders, going down to Bunnings and getting yourself a little snake to, making sure your windows are properly sealed, trying to do things like that to lower your energy consumption because, we don't just need to get onto renewables. We're doing that, but it's going to take a while. So actually lowering your energy use is also going to really help, especially at the moment when energy prices are just going through the roof, globally as well as here. So it's all about making your home environment as sound as it can be. It's pretty well about electrifying everything, so being supportive of the government when they go for their renewable energy zones, thinking about the transport that we have, active transport, making sure that, if you can have solar, you put solar in with batteries if it makes sense. It doesn't make sense for every household, but, where it does. Eventually we'll all be moving to electric vehicles and, we'll change the way we drive. At some point of time, we'll probably have autonomous vehicles, but that's a whole other question that will change the dynamic of our traffic. So there are lots of things we can do up front, and no individual should think that it's all on them. It's not, this is a collective thing. There are industries that are, the biggest polluters, but householders can also make a difference by how they invest, how they vote, obviously, where they invest, putting pressure on the companies they invest in or purchase from to make sure that, they're all on the net zero journey with them. But then, so that's the things you can do up front. And obviously then it's about how we respond to the climate events that are kind of already trapped into the system, that, no matter how strongly we act now, there's a certain amount that we're going to do. So part of that's about that mitigation in terms of, or adaptation in terms of, I talked about levies, about things you can do in your house if you're in a cyclone area. Obviously, raising houses, shoring up if you're going to be affected by coastal erosion. There are lots of things we can do to help the community and also the individual house in terms of the materials you use, fire breaks, all sorts of pretty obvious things. And I know trees are lovely, and it is wonderful to be surrounded by them. But in this, let's face it, in this country, you've got to be a bit more careful to not at least have them right on your doorstep. And then, of course, then there are the things that, where you have to make those tough decisions where we were talking earlier about, well, actually, is this house, this area, so vulnerable that there is nothing that I can do? that, this is what governments are looking at now, as to, perhaps land buybacks and swaps, so that people might end up having to move. And that is obviously the last thing you want, the last course of action. But for some, it might be inevitable that that's where they go. But, then we add the broader, all right, well, where do we build next? I mean, if you think about cities like Amsterdam or Venice, they're not going to pack up and move either. So but they have some amazing engineering,
solutions.
Solutions, thank you, that, are helping them to deal with what for them is, catastrophic pretty well everywhere, in terms of rising water levels and propensity to be flooded. So, there are things that we can do. Human beings are incredibly ingenious, and there are amazing people out there working on all sorts of solutions. So from that adaptation point of view as well. So of course it costs money. That's the thing. But as we talked about earlier, you have to weigh up, well, what's the cost of adapting versus the cost of just picking up everything and moving. And at the moment, it's not clear. I mean, the social costs are very clear. It's a difficult one, but from an economic perspective, less clear.
I wish I could remember the exact figures, but when we interviewed Margaret Cook, the author of Brisbane, a River with a City Problem, she was talking, there's such a ridiculously high proportion of the money that is spent following a major event like a flood is repairs as opposed to mitigation. And look, I wish I could remember the exact figure, but I think it's single digit that was mitigation versus, repair. And I guess that has to change. There has to be much more money spent on mitigation so that they can reduce that repair bill over time. And she was talking about things like, changing the ways in which houses are rebuilt, with stainless steel cabinetry in kitchens, for instance, rather than the entire kitchen having to be thrown out every time there's water swelling up all the particle board. So there's those sort of practical things. But the other thing too that was really interesting when I read that book was this idea of our short memories. And I guess with climate change, because with the flooding, for instance, the last one was 2011, and then everyone there was a period of time where it was, raw in everybody's memory, and then everyone sort of got over it, and then there was a bit of a property boom, and the properties that were flood affected and flood prone sold for similar prices to those that weren't, and then all of a sudden their values have plummeted, as people have been reminded. So I guess with the intensity and increased frequency of these major events, unnatural disasters as you call them, I guess we won't have the opportunity or the luxury to forget, potentially. And maybe that's got something to do with why, what that's necessary in order for things to actually change substantially, perhaps.
Oh, look, I think so. I mean, it's human nature for us to react to something that we see in front of our face rather than something that someone tells us is a risk, which explains why people smoke. Unless you can actually see the damage being done and know that you're the person that's going to get lung cancer, people go, oh, probably not me. And it's the same with climate until, I'm sure people in Lismore, didn't forget, but I think we're in danger that the rest of us do because it's not in our face every day. I mean, there's still homes and vast swathes of the countryside that haven't been rebuilt from the fires, let alone the floods. You look at the businesses that have gone out. I mean, it's just astronomical. And it's not just Australia, of course. We're seeing this in headlines around the world, from the California fires in Europe last summer. Flooding, like this is something that we are seeing regularly, almost every month around the world. We are seeing these events. And so it's I hate to use the phrase, but burned into people's, consciousness now that climate events are, it's real and it's now. It's no longer something that's in the future. And I think that's a big change in the dynamic of why people voted the way they did, and why they are understanding more, not just because of the floods, and because those were horrendous and we were all shocked by it. But I think, that's why I think that Climate Council report, and go on the website and play around and put your suburb in, and have a look at what the risks are, and you can break it down, whether it's flooding or fire or other things. The first time I looked at that, I was shocked. I mean, I knew things were not great, but I was actually quite gobsmacked at how much risk there is. And, you know, it's, you talk about what might happen to property prices. There's some areas where, you know, if there aren't community actions or there aren't things that can be done with houses, you know, these properties will end up being worth nothing. They will, you know, it's not just that you can't insure them. You know, I heard somebody on the radio the other day talking about self-insuring. Well, you know, there's not too many people that can self-insure for you know, their house being destroyed every 10 years. You know, most people are now taking 30 years to pay off a home. So, and you're right, it does affect those who are most vulnerable in our society more. You know, they live in these more prone areas because they are cheaper, because they are more risky. You know, and you have this awful vicious circle of impact there. So I am more optimistic though that we are really taking strides, that we have accepted the problem and that we now have governments at all levels, because we knew states and local governments were doing more, but we now have 3 levels of government that really are focused in the same direction. But clearly we have a lot more to do, particularly around planning, around building codes. You know, we can't just be all happy and pat ourselves on the back for saying, yeah, we voted for net zero. You know, we actually have to do something about it now.
A job not necessarily done yet. The other thing that potentially has been burned into our retinas, is to coin your phrase there, is this idea that we can't necessarily control nature. You know, I think that there's a fallacy that man can control nature, or we often think that we can. I think those bushfires of 2020, certainly the flood coming again after 2 weeks, you know, in Lismore, and Brisbane flooded twice too, within a month too, didn't it? Only recently. And then I watched that and I'm sure you watched that Four Corners report that was on a few months back, I think in April, that aired, and that was right at that time in Sydney in particular. We were just unprecedented, that great big word that everyone uses ever since 2020. The amount of rainfall that we had, that we just seemed to have this cloud over us that was never going to move on. And potentially we've finally worked it out that actually we are just futile little human beings. At the end of the day, the planet is a much bigger force than we are. So hopefully if that is in our conscience, in our collective consciousness, that we will individually and collectively do something about it. Now, Nicki, you know, we like to ask our guests if you have a property Dumbo example for us. Do you have an example of property Dumbo, something that a lesson that we could all learn from a silly story?
Well, I don't know if I've got a silly story, but I think, you know, when you do buy a property, I think you have to really look into what are the risks. We are facing potentially a 3rd consecutive La Nina, which means more flooding. Now, you might be in an area that's not particularly near a river or creek system or whatever, but if your property is at the bottom of a hill and there isn't good drainage, you know, and we've got really heavy rains, that's the thing with climate change. We know for every degree the temperature rise, extra 7% moisture in the air. That's why you get those massive downpours. More lightning strikes, more, you know, energy in the atmosphere. So if you're at the bottom of a hill, think about, you know, look for the plans, you know, go through in detail what is it that are the risks, you know, where are you in terms of the bushland around you, you know, what are the things that you can do, and understand your risk, and find out before you buy the property what the insurance premium is going to be. Don't wait till too late to find out that it's something that's way outside your things. So be prepared. I think it's something that none of us used to think about beforehand, and now everybody should be. You know, don't make that mistake. You know, find out everything you can about your climate risk in a property, even risks that you might not think off the top of your head.
Well, it's a good point, and we've certainly added the map on the Climate Council's website onto our due diligence process for that exact reason. Certainly in Home Buyer Academy, we have an online course helping first home buyers learn the process, and that's something that we're endorsing now, that people do check get a quote for insurance prior to buying the property. It's funny, when there was floods in Taree last year, and I remember seeing some poor guy on the news, and he was scratching his head because he just lost his house, and he was saying that he only just bought it, first home buyer, didn't insure it because his bill was something like $13,000 the first time he got a bill, and he went, oh my God, I can't afford that. I've just bought my first property and now he's lost it. Horrific story. Just tragic. It's just gutting, really. And I think this is becoming much more of an issue, isn't it? But I think too, what's really important too is to think it's not just the individual property that's prone, but like you're talking about levies potentially in certain areas. These are all going to increase the cost of insuring all property. So my business partner for Home Buyer Academy, Megan Wells, is a buyer's agent up in Brisbane, and so she's very familiar with the issue of flooding, and you talk about not just those in flood zones or close to rivers, but on getting overland flooding as well. Who would have thought of that if you're not from Brisbane, not born and bred? So I agree with you. Checking those risks and the things that you couldn't even possibly anticipate, because of course they're not in your zone of reference, but to really dig into that. Nicki, this has been a really interesting chat, and really do appreciate you coming on and sharing some of your research and some of the insights that you have. It's a very serious thing, and we want to make sure that all our listeners continue to take this seriously. So thanks so much for coming on.
No, thank you. And please don't be all doom and gloom. We can be optimistic too that there are things we can do to make things better. So, there's a positive side to this as well. But yeah, we need to get our skates on.
Yeah, time to act. Yeah, absolutely. Let's say we still got time. Let's do it. Thank you.
If you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or North Shore, my team and I can help you buy without regrets. Reach out via my website, gooddeeds.com.au.
If you're looking to buy your first home, thinking of upgrading into a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, my team love to carefully guide you on this journey. And most importantly, get the finance right. Reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love to see you again.
And remember, don't be a Dumbo.